Hi, I'm Pat Horn from South Africa. I work for WeGo, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, with a focus on collective bargaining in the informal economy. So the first time was in 1995 and 1996 for a discussion on a convention on home-based work, which eventually became Convention 177. I was in an organization called the Self-Employed Women's Union in South Africa, which had been formed along the lines of SEVA, Self-Employed Women's Association in India. And SEVA, together with the IUF, had been preparing for this convention for some time, because SEVA had a lot of home-based workers as their members. We came under IUF labels into that meeting, and we were not well integrated at that stage. We met a situation of quite some hostility in the workers' group, because a lot of the members of the workers' group were fearful of recognizing workers in the informal economy, particularly own account workers. We had to basically start learning how to navigate in this situation where we were outsiders pretty much. But we were able to attend the workers' group meetings and look for some spaces to make inputs. And we were able to bring materials about home-based workers, which was extremely helpful. And that's the way that we persuaded the workers who were concerned about recognizing our sector. Firstly, we had to get accredited. This is before StreetNet had its own accreditation. So we had to get somebody to put us in their delegation. But they would always put us in their delegation with the proviso that they were not going to be paying. So we had to raise our own funds. We used to get very limited amount of funds. We would have very small delegations. We would pay as little as possible. We would either, if there were 5 or 6, hire one studio apartment and then all live in the same studio apartment. When we knew somebody living in Geneva, we would sometimes live in their house, sleep on their couch in their study. We would try to alternate and have different workers coming each time so that we could train them in how to navigate the space of the International Labour Conference. And even with those small delegations that we had, we managed to get quite well known on very low resources. I remember one person from Liberia coming with 2 people instead of 1, and we said to her, "We've only got a per diem for you." And she said, no, we'll share the per diem, we'll share the bed, everything. So the 2 of them, and they'd raised funds for another ticket somewhere in Liberia themselves. Very resourceful. Each time that we came to the International Labour Conference, we would arrange a lunchtime meeting. In those days, International Labour Conferences were 3 weeks, and lunch breaks were 2 hours. They were from 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock. So that lunch break was quite a good time for arranging meetings like that. So just once during the whole conference, we would arrange a meeting, get a room for it. There were pigeonholes for all the countries. We would put invitations for the workers in every single pigeonhole and invite all the workers in the whole conference there. The invitations went specifically to the workers, not to the employers or the governments. And even when we put it in the pigeonhole for a certain country, we said this is for the workers. So a lot of workers who didn't know much about this would come to those meetings. And in those meetings, we would report about what's happening around the world in organizing in the informal economy. And we would invite information from the people who came to those meetings. So those meetings helped us to make a lot of contacts that we hadn't necessarily known before. It helped us to expand our broad network to have those meetings. The workers at the ILO got to know us quite well, having seen us, not every year, every couple of years. And became more accepting. So the whole relationship with them was gradually improving over the years. So part of the purpose was to go and have some impact on the text of whatever instrument we were discussing, and part of it was our networking and alliance building strategy. The ILO had started to realize they needed to do something about the informal economy, and they had scheduled 3 discussions to introduce instruments for the informal economy. The first one they introduced was part-time work, which was discussed in 1993 and 94. To be honest, there's not anything that informal about part-time work. The second one was the home-based work one, the one that we came for. And then the third was contract work. The employers were unhappy about all of these. They didn't want any of these to be regulated. And they successfully sabotaged the one on contract work. So the one on contract work never came off. SEWA, in the meantime, they'd approached me in particular because we had the self-employed women's union in South Africa, where the majority of members were street vendors, about actually setting up an international body of street vendors. There were a lot of discussions happening at the ILO. There were not yet International Labour Conference discussions about the informal, it was called the informal sector in those days. And people in this loose network of ours, SEWU and SEWA and the HomeNet organizations, were participating in these discussions. And then they put an item on the agenda in 2002 on decent work in the informal economy. By this time, StreetNet was in the process of preparing to be established. So we'd learnt enough about how the ILO worked to come there knowing a little bit more about what to expect. And the participation in the discussion on decent work in the informal economy was a very central and key discussion. WEGO, which was not accredited in the ILO in those days, was working with certain of the departments of the ILO. There was somebody in the gender department who worked a lot on this particular resolution. And so she worked with us in the WEGO group. She advised us about how we should make sure that we got our voice in there. She said to us that because this is a resolution, there's going to be a drafting committee. You need to try and get somebody into the drafting committee. She introduced us to the friendly people within the situation. And in the meantime, we'd also been lobbying some of the unions. So we had quite a bit of support from some of the unions that were active in the workers' group, the Danish Women Workers Union and the Dutch FNV, and in fact, most of the Nordic unions, the American AFL-CIO, were very favorably disposed towards us as well. Some of the European unions used to keep their distance. They were still worried about self-employed workers. We ended up with a resolution on decent work in the informal economy, which I think laid a basis for us to discuss about the informal economy in the future. It was the culmination of many of these meetings that had been held over the previous 4 or 5 years. After the 2002 resolution on decent work in the informal economy, which we've been using ever since, we then looked for opportunities in other years where there were topics where we wanted to make inputs. And in 2004, there was a discussion on migrant work. And we decided to attend the discussion on migrant work so that we could put forward the issues pertaining to migrant workers in the informal economy, and particularly in the street trade sector, cross-border traders. And before attending the International Labour Conference in 2004, StreetNet applied for accreditation and got the accreditation. So the first time when StreetNet was there under its name was 2004. In 2007, there was a discussion on the employment relationship. It was one of the unfinished business from the sabotaged subcontracting convention, which never happened. And we attended that one so that we could make more gains around the recognition of own account workers. In 2002, we got a clause actually articulating what own account workers were. It was the first time that this term had been properly articulated, and it was one that was very controversial, and it took a vote to achieve it. So now that we had the concept of own account work, because of course for StreetNet, the vast majority of street vendors are own account workers. So the one on employment relationship we came and attended. To be honest, I'm not sure how useful that one was in the long run. But of course it helped us to polish our way of working at the ILO. So we would go every 2 or 3 years to the International Labour Conference. In 2010, there was a discussion on HIV/AIDS in the world of work. And we went, StreetNet sent a delegation there. That one on HIV/AIDS in the world of work made an important breakthrough in the definition of the workplace. And the breakthrough that that was made that year was to define the workplace as any place where somebody is performing work for livelihoods or income. It took us away from traditional workplaces and acknowledged that any place where people are working, which meant it could be public space, it could be homes that people work in. We would go to these, broader topics and then input the situation of workers in the informal economy. And the people in the workers group became more and more used to this and more accepting of these broader categories, so that they would cover a broader range of workers, including those in the informal economy. After the Decent Work in the Informal Economy resolution in 2002, we had established a framework that is pretty much what we started to use in StreetNet and in most of WeGo. And then by this time there was a lot of organization happening towards a domestic workers convention. WeGo did a lot of work towards the domestic workers convention, and that one was then adopted in 2011. It was 2010 and 2011. And the elephant in the room was that none of these conventions for the informal economy had actually dealt with the situation of own account workers. Domestic workers are very clearly employees, and even though there are many home workers, they're not covered by that Convention 177. And so clearly what was, missing was some sort of an instrument for own account workers in the informal economy, which meant the street vending sector, the waste picker sector, and plenty of other work in the informal economy, a lot of the transport workers, etc. So there was a lot of agitation at the level of the governing body, where some of the workers and governments who felt that we should be going in that direction were looking at how can we have an instrument or a convention on workers in the informal economy. The problem is that the ILO structure doesn't lend itself to recognizing self-employed workers, because it's tripartite and it usually depends on an employer-employee relationship. Of course, the world of work and the way it's been developing is there's more and more kinds of work that don't have an employment relationship. So after a lot of discussion in the governing body about how to deal with this, they then took a decision to table on the agenda of the International Labour Conference for 2014 and 2015 a discussion on the informal economy. There was a lot of discussion about what to call it, because there's a lot of discomfort with informality, even among the trade union movement, among a lot of the governments, particularly in the global north. So they came up with the title of Transitions from the Informal to the Formal Economy. In our networks, in StreetNet and WeGo and so on, everybody was horrified. They hated this talk about formalization, and they didn't want to even go there. Those of us who'd been working for the past 10 years or more on building alliances with the trade union movements realized that it was probably smarter to embrace the issue of formalization, but actually insist on talking about the formalization we want, as opposed to refusing to talk about formalization, Because what we realized is that every single demand that the workers that we were organizing was asking for, whether it was identity cards, it was access to social protection, it was proper legal coverage, all of those are formalization demands, actually. So the sort of myth about workers in the informal economy, that they want to be under the radar, they're trying to dodge tax, all of these kind of things were what people used to think is the reason why, we don't like formalization. But in fact, it's because of the unilateral ways of doing formalization. But if we were to have formalization that was fighting for the demands that our workers were always asking for, that's formalization in a rights-based sense. The discussion that started in 2014 then, what was good about that was that the framework for the documentation that was prepared by the ILO to start that discussion going was a framework that based itself on the what we'd agreed on 2002. So the way of understanding the informal economy, which was a consensual framework between the three social partners. But then this formalization process meant a rights-based formalization process that would be in the interests of the workers in the informal economy and the entities in the informal economy, where there was a struggle as to what to call them. The employers, of course, wanted to call them enterprises, micro-enterprises, etc. And we had a big fight about that and eventually agreed on the language of economic units, because that includes enterprises as well as cooperatives and other kinds of worker-controlled entities. So we then didn't have to fight any battles for the framework because it was based on the 2002 one. And that's always an advantage when you do get something in the ILO. If you do get a good framework, you can then base other things on that framework, because things tend to get cast in stone once they've been adopted at the International Labour Conference. We then went into what were the details of the integrated economic policies that needed to be adopted. There was the whole part about social protection. There was a whole part about collective bargaining in the informal economy. What is needed for a formalization in the interests of workers and economic units in the informal economy. So that was then placed onto the agenda for 2014 and 2015. StreetNet worked together with WeGo. WeGo had been accredited to come to the International Labour Conference in 2007, so 3 years after StreetNet. So WeGo started coming and accompanying StreetNet delegations. Sometimes WeGo would have funds for about 4 people, and then they would pay for a StreetNet person and another person from the home workers and another person from the waste pickers. So StreetNet usually didn't have enough money to send, sometimes nobody at all. We then prepared quite well, and we had regional meetings arranged through our networks. So StreetNet, WeGo, HomeNet, domestic workers worked together. We knew there was going to be a lot of misunderstanding as to what formalization we were fighting for, and what is our kind of formalization as opposed to the one that the employers would want or some of the governments would want. Because in practice, what we'd realized by then is that the reason why there was no agreement about the issue of formalization is that governments mainly wanted formalization so they could widen their tax base. Employers mainly wanted formalization so they could pretty much outlaw all kinds of informal work to reduce competition from people in the informal economy. And we wanted a rights-based formalization, which was then a package of legal recognition, access to social protection, access to all of the pillars of decent work. Everyone had their own take on formalization. Hence, we persuaded our colleagues in the WeGo network that we should use this framework to our advantage, because it's the way that we would get the support of all the unions who were so keen on formalization, sometimes for the wrong reasons. We were not exactly looking for support from the employers, but to get something through the ILO, there needed to be some level of consensus. So, and then with governments, there were many of our governments who were struggling with regulating or developing policies for work in the informal economy, and we saw this as being something that was going to help us to develop those policies. And if there were some standards set by the ILO, we thought it could help us in our policy negotiations that we were having in various countries. And some people say it's the first instrument for the informal economy. It wasn't, because the first ones were home workers and even domestic workers. But it was the first instrument which was broadly based, and it also included then own account workers and didn't rely on an employment relationship. And so it's become a sort of a seminal recommendation. There was also no chance of it ever being a convention. But actually we thought that was better. Countries only have an obligation to implement a convention once they've ratified it. And they can all stall the ratification, or they can ratify very fast and have poor implementation. So the fact that you have to have ratification in between with a convention also means that when you're negotiating for a convention, the governments are much more conservative as to what they're willing to agree to. They agree to more innovative things when they're talking about a recommendation, because then on the other side there's not such strong obligations on the implementation side. So there are a lot of people who feel that recommendations are not so useful because there's no obligation to implement. But it's a balance between, an obligation to implement something that's not that good in the first place, or something which is much better, which, to be honest, to get it implemented, you have to be very well organized on the ground. So that's all it really is. It's a tool that can be used if you're well organized on the ground. And, in StreetNet at the time, we felt that was something that was going to be more useful for us. Wherever we had good organization, Recommendation 204 pretty much covers most of the things that any of our members ever asked for, because it covers the demands they want to make to local governments, it covers the question of social protection, it covers all the rights, it covers a lot of policy issues and integrated policy issues which are very important. So that's why it became such an important instrument for us, despite, or maybe because, of being only a recommendation. C190 wasn't specifically about the informal economy, but it had strong mention of the informal economy in it. It was the first instrument, probably, after Recommendation 204, where we were then able to come and give a lot of informal economy content into what was actually a general recommendation. The the applause that countries get when they ratify conventions can be a bit of a false start. Anyway, the point of all these struggles for recognition of workers in the informal economy and their rights to organize is for them to achieve the rights of direct collective bargaining in order to be their own agents of change for the better in their working lives.